Good morning, Manifesta guests. It's pretty early, I think, for everybody of us, but I kindly welcome you to the Incubator for a Pan-African Biennial, a project conceptualized by ACAF, Alexandria Contemporary Arts Festival, especially Bassam Al-Baroni and Jeremy Baudry. It is a part of Manifesta 8, and I really want to thank Bassam and Jeremy, who are very much committed to this project and all the time and effort they put into it. I also want to thank very specially the Khadija Biennial, who is the coordinator of this project, together with Sophia Patat, because this is a project which is a collaboration between Manifesta Foundation and Manifesta 8, since it's a project which is not finished with the end of Manifesta 8, but will continue after Manifesta 8 is closed. It's one of those more sustainable projects, hopefully, the research projects, which will be supported after Manifesta 8 by the Manifesta Foundation. I want to thank very much all the members of the task force, and especially the coordinator of the task force, Gabi Ngcobo, who have put a lot of work and effort in getting this symposium together. The whole project will consist of this symposium, a website, a publication, and a later to be defined workshop in an African country. I would like to thank everybody who is participating, the 6 keynote speakers, and I wish you a very successful but also a fruitful day. Thank you. I would like now to pass on to Bassam Al-Baroni, who would like to give a more profound introduction to the content of the project. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Hedwig, for your brief introduction. And perhaps I can start with why proposing a biennial. And my response to that would be that it's not necessarily a biennial. It's the prospect of a concept, the prospect of surpassing the institutionalized humanism that we all suffer from in the African continent. It's the prospect of taking things into our own hands and proposing something that we can be proud of. When Jeremy and I began thinking about what to propose to the idea of a dialogue with Northern Africa, the first thing we decided to do was to forget about Northern Africa and to think about Africa in general. Because it's within the categorizations, within the small subliminal pocketing of identities that things begin to go wrong. We thought of asking the Manifesta Foundation to support us in inaugurating, putting something on the table, something that could be and might not be, but an attempt should be made, I think. Whatever is the outcome, I'm sure it will be something that has gone through a collaborative and communicative process, and this is our intent. We hope that everybody will enjoy the discussions in the upcoming days and also realize that this hopefully is just the beginning, and that the outcome is something that we don't know. And there's no intent on forcing an outcome, but that the framework that we've proposed is all about trying to achieve an outcome. Thank you very much.
Good morning and welcome to the symposium. I have a few things to say, and then I will play a short film as a part of my introduction. There's a few changes on the program. So the first session, I will be moderating the first session because unfortunately Billy Bijoka could not be with us today because of other commitments. So the first session, we will start with Ngcobo and then follow with Thembinkosi Goniwe. I would like also to stress that this is an inquiry process to discuss the possibilities, logistic possibilities, intellectual possibilities, and the creative possibilities of a model which is similar to Manifesta, of a roaming biennale within the African continent. I would like to introduce the moderator for the next session, her name is Ato Malinda, who's a performance and installation video artist from Nairobi, Kenya, and she will introduce the speakers for the next session. I would also like to introduce Eyene. Most of this information is in your press pack, so I'm not going to bother with reading too much out of it. Eyene, who's an art critic and independent curator and consultant, who is at the moment based in London doing a PhD. She would be our respondent responding in at the end of each section. So we will have the two speakers per session, and we will have a Q&A where we will solicit questions, comments from the audience, and then Christine will come and respond to the sections. But I would like to, before I play the film, I'll play the film and then we'll go directly into the speakers, so Ngone will come. I would like to introduce Ngcobo, who is an independent curator, art critic, and consultant in cultural engineering. She was the editorial director of the Paris-based contemporary African art magazine River Noir from 1994 to 2001. She has edited books on contemporary visual art and photography in Africa, including an anthology of African art, the 20th century, photographers from Kinshasa, and an anthology of African and Indian Ocean photography, a century of African photographers. She has curated exhibitions in Africa, Europe, and the USA. And in 2001, she was one of the curators of the African Photography Biennale in Bamako, Mali, and a guest curator at the 2002 Dakar Biennale in Senegal. As a consultant in cultural engineering, she's the author of the strategic plans, orientation programs, and evaluation reports for Senegalese and international cultural institutions. She teaches communication strategies and methodology in the Master Department in Cultural Industries of the Senghor University in Alexandria, Egypt. She's also a founding member of Dakar-based collective GAO, a platform for research and production in the field of new media and visual arts. Thembinkosi Goniwe is an art critic, writer, and curator, lecturing at the Wits School of Arts University in Johannesburg, South Africa. He has a master's in fine arts degree from the University of Cape Town, where he also taught. He also holds a master's of arts in the history of art from Cornell University, where he's completing his PhD in art history. He has taken up art residencies, participated in conferences and exhibitions nationally and internationally. So I will go ahead and play a very short film, which is a film that was made to promote or to think about the idea of having a biennale in Cape Town, which was called the Cape, simply Cape 09.
The world has become a global village where nations converge, engage, and celebrate culture. The cultural playground of choice in major cities around the world are mega exhibitions and biennales. These far-flung destinations actively promote their unique and evolving cultures through high-profile art events as part of the never-ending process of cultural reinvention and innovation. But cultural identity is determined not only by past and present realities, it is defined by our aspirations, our versions of not only who we are, but of what we are becoming. Cape Town is no longer a remote and beautiful city on the southern tip of Africa. It is developing an identity as one of the arts and cultural capitals of the world, and Africa's foremost city. The mother city has become a new cultural center, a high-profile hit player in the global arena, combining a natural splendor and historic resonance with a vibrant creative energy. Cape Town needs to harness this creative energy, increase resources for culture, and create new art events that unleash this unexploited economic potential. As a result of research initiated in mid-2002 by the Airports Company in South Africa, in collaboration with the city of Cape Town, a new international scale art event was conceived, an event focused on contemporary African art, simply called CAPE. CAPE will reconnect Cape Town with Africa and the diaspora. Inspired by mega exhibitions around the world, CAPE is not another biennale. It is the fulcrum of an ongoing program of projects specifically designed to confront the problems of previous mega exhibitions and address the needs of our South African context. Our vision is to create a flagship cultural event for the Cape and for South Africa, a platform for the contemporary art of the continent and the diaspora. Our long-term objective is to present leading contemporary art in an accessible, experiential way, facilitating art awareness, skills transfer, and training. CAPE is proactively geared to engage the local public while attracting artists, intellectuals, journalists, and art lovers from around the world. Through a process of cultural mapping, CAPE will create a route linking exhibitions, multimedia art projects, performances, and public art sites. A cultural corridor traversing the peninsula and bridging its multifaceted landscapes and communities. CAPE views art as integral to daily life and vital to development and transformation in our new democracy. Scheduled to take place every September, CAPE will position itself at the cutting edge of contemporary art, culture, and debate. CAPE aims to support and promote contemporary African art. It will explore and engage with issues integral to Africa and the diaspora, facilitating dialogue and cultural exchange. In its inaugural year, CAPE will provide a platform for an international conference and a series of workshops. The following year, CAPE will host a major exhibition designed around the geography of the Cape Peninsula and integrated into the African cultural matrix. These events will alternate annually. They will be global in scope and impact. CAPE will stimulate the art market, create new audiences, raise our cultural awareness, and confront and celebrate our social-cultural difference. CAPE will boost cultural tourism by helping to define a new, uniquely African cultural identity for Cape Town, contributing to cultural renewal, development, and economic growth. Most importantly, CAPE will engage with local communities to ensure socio-economic benefits and tangible legacy. Culture needs creative research and development to grow. By creating a vibrant forum for new perspectives that challenge the status quo, CAPE can reinforce the city's status as one of the world's creative cultural hotspots.
Ngone, I welcome you on stage.
Good morning. Are you hearing me? No? Maybe I should sit down. It's fine. I have a large voice normally, like most of the Senegalese. Yes, it's interesting that she's talking about Cape because I'm going to give a brief overview of the major platforms we have on the continent. And Cape was one of the largest one that was created, and it died in silence 2 years ago. So about the large-scale Pan-African visual art events in Africa, of course I will name Dakar, which is a Pan-African Contemporary Art Biennale born in 1992 out of a local government political will, and it's operated by the Senegalese Ministry of Culture. That's the oldest one on the south of the Sahara. There's also Bamako, the Photography Encounters, born in 94, but that is a French initiative, and it's still to date operated in Paris by an institution called Culture France. So you have to know that in Africa, we don't consider Bamako as a Pan-African project, even if it's a biennale for African photographers. The fact that it's created by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs and operated in Paris, we don't see it in Africa as an African project. And then, of course, there was Cape Town that was born in 2007, also out of a local political will. And Cape Platform died in silence after 2 editions. It died this year. And I hope, Gabi, when we will have the conversation, you will explain why it died in silence and why nobody cared, including myself, because I didn't answer the email. Because Gabi was on the curatorial team of the first edition of Cape Town. But that's a quite interesting, I think, starting point for a conversation that one initiative started in Africa and nobody jumped in to join force and do something about it. And we're still complaining that we need more platforms in Africa. So maybe we're all schizophrenic down there. I can also mention smaller private African initiatives, because the other ones are government initiatives, Bamako, Dakar, and Cape Town. But private African initiatives, such as the newborn Sud in Cameroon, it's an urban salon of design and visual arts that will take place in December. It will be the 2nd edition, and that's a private initiative that is operated by an independent art space called Doualart in Douala. There's also the defunct Eole that was in Togo in the 90s, and Boulevard in Benin. Those were smaller art events. And I deliberately do not mention the Cairo Biennale, operated by the Egyptian Ministry of Culture, because it is an international event, not Pan-African, and it has never succeeded in connecting with the south of the Sahara. So it's an international event, not Pan-African, and they never looked back down the rest of the Sahara. So I don't consider it part of this conversation today. Other international, rather than just Pan-African visual arts event, there is Photo Cairo in Egypt as well, but that's an international event. And there's the defunct Photo Fiesta in Maputo, Mozambique, that stopped, unfortunately, 2 years ago. So basically, we have 2 Pan-African visual arts events, large-scale art events on the continent. But maybe I can say just one if you consider that Bamako is not really a Pan-African biennale by its nature and the fact that it's done and produced outside of the continent by non-African people. So we're left with Dakar, which is quite bizarre for one continent. Because Dakar is operated by bureaucrats, it has failed to fulfill the expectations of the art communities because it almost never had a curator or an artistic director, thus ignoring any critical curatorial practice and discourse, because that's the case of Dakar. It's operated by the Ministry of Culture, but sometimes they have a guest curators, and sometimes they just decided to have a selection committee, and so you can see from one edition to the other the weakness or the lack of content of the event, and it's very frustrating for art professionals. But despite all these frustrations, it has been generating over the years. Dakar remains by default the biggest and most important visual art platform in Africa. We all complain every 2 years about the lack of content, but always fear that the Senegalese government might close it down. Dakar is mainly used as a meeting place to network, and visitors hope to find at least one artwork or artist that will make the day. I'm a little bit cynical, but it's Sunday morning. so forgive me. And it's also my hometown, so I can say that. At the turn of the millennium, I started to hear the idea that Dakar should be touring on the continent so that Africans who cannot afford to make it to Senegal can have a chance to see the main exhibition in their own country. I believe that this is a romantic idea, just to be mild, as I don't think that other African states will be ready to make the same financial commitment Senegal is doing. Because you have to know that Senegal is a very small country and that 50% or 60% of the funding is coming from the Senegalese government to make a Pan-African Biennale for the entire continent. So that's a unique example on the continent. So I don't think it's fair that my tax money should go all over the place, and who is going to pay for that? And other states never raised any interest in saying, okay, I will host part of the Dakar Biennale exhibition in my country. So this idea might seem nice, but it's not really feasible. And it's the Dakar Biennale, that's the name. It's not the Africa Biennale, if you have to remember. I think also that it is fair to question the monopoly of Dakar, and I understand quite well that a continent made out of 53 countries deserves more than one big visual art event that is not fulfilling our needs. So here we are in Murcia discussing the idea of a Pan-African rooming Biennale based on a Manifesta model. But is a rooming Pan-African Biennale the best alternative for the continent? Is this model realistic in an African context? So I'm just going to list very briefly, this is just to start after a conversation among us, because I was thinking about this idea of a rooming Biennale, of course. There's for it and there's against it, and as we say, we're trying to answer before we get the question. So if I put a list of for a rooming Biennale, of course we need a platform that will act as a catalyst. A platform showing the best, the brightest, the most cutting-edge artworks. A platform that will challenge ideas, laying down critical discourses that will resonate worldwide, not just in Africa. Basically, we need a vision for the continent. So that's one argument for it. Another argument for it will be a rooming Biennale will enable the growth and reinforcement of continental networks and artistic collaborations, highlight the variety of African contexts based on site-specific artworks and projects. Because we also tried that model of site-specific works in Dakar in a very modest way. And it's also a very interesting way to interact and engage foreign artists with the city, with the history and the urban planning of a city. So that's an argument for it. If you have a rooming Biennale, then you can spread it and make it bigger. A rooming platform will also facilitate in-depth research in the field of art theory and art history in various African countries, emphasize and increase local contemporary art publications while facilitating access to it. Because if you take the place of the Dakar Biennale or with the Cape Town or even the Cairo Biennale, if you don't go to the city, you will not get the catalog. The Dakar Biennale, you can't buy it online on the internet. You can't buy it in Paris, New York, London, whatsoever. So if you have a rooming Biennale, people can have better access to these publications. And this can also encourage people who are doing research, scholars, academics, curators, or artists who are doing research in some countries. That could also raise curiosity and interest, saying, oh, okay, what do I know about Mozambique, for example? Nothing. The next platform is going to be in Mozambique. Let's take that opportunity and kind of connect with the team and do deeper research, because that's what we're lacking a lot, writing by Africans about contemporary African art. We're still missing that. Even if we've been trying to do things the past 15 years, when I was at Revue Noire, I still feel that there's much to do. That's your task. So, such a project can also generate a new generation of African curators and trained cultural operators, because you can use such a platform also to have assistance and to do mentoring, which Dakar never did. So that's also an argument for it. And because it's rooming, it could also become a more democratic event by creating a wider access to art education and a better local understanding of contemporary art. Because why did I hear this idea of, oh, Dakar should be touring? It's because other people from other countries coming to Dakar, they were feeling, oh, you are so lucky that every 2 years you can have access to all these artworks and all these artists and listen to all these conferences. So if it's touring, then it becomes more democratic. So one day, Ghanaian audience will have access to it, the other day it will be I don't know what. So that could be one argument for it, that the people and the local public and the education program will be more open, and then people can start thinking that, okay, art is not just for entertainment, which is the case mainly from the political side in Africa, that they see art as entertainment, and they often put aside any kind of educational program. So if you have a rooming biennale, that could emphasize this interest in what is contemporary art. And such an event, even if it's hard to monitor it, I believe that this could have an impact on local art markets and probably increase the group of African collectors. Also, that's also one argument against it. You have to keep money in mind. So this seems all good for the art and for Africans, right? So these are a list of 6 arguments that will be for it. We can go deeper in this discussion. And of course, I have arguments against it. Or maybe let's say more warning, just trying to be positive. One argument that will be against it will be the logistic. I cannot imagine the nightmare of such a project based on the poor cultural infrastructures in the majority of our countries, the lack of international experience, local art managers, as well as weak state cultural policies and visions. Because I don't know how you can do a rooming biennale if you have a host country and if local politicians, whether it's the mayor of the city, the minister of culture, the government is not involved. It's simply not possible. I don't know how Manifesta works. I have no experience about it. But just from my experience being one of the assessors of the Dakar Biennale and being one of the advisors to the minister, it's not possible. If you don't have a local political will and commitment, it will never happen. So when you're doing a rooming biennale with all these logistics that you have to think about, moving the artworks from one place to another, moving the office to one place to another, and also how do you make these states have a commitment, knowing that none of them were never interested to copy the model of Dakar Biennale, which started in '92, and say, oh, I also want a Biennale. So that's an argument against it, that we have to be very aware of that. Another argument is the language. As you all know, Africa is not a country. It's a continent. And we don't just have French, English, Portuguese, and Arab, and Spanish. We also have local languages. We have Zulu. She was speaking Zulu this morning. And nobody could understand her, of course. So, and what happens is that we always assume that English is the international language that we use to communicate worldwide. But you have to know that in French-speaking Africa, we don't see things that way. Okay, I speak English, but people who have worked with the Dakar Biennale, Gabi, you've worked with the Dakar Biennale, well, try to contact them. They will not answer the emails. Of course, it's a Biennale that is operated by the Ministry of Culture, and they don't speak English. So if you write an email in English, it's not, when they don't answer, it's not that they're not polite, it's that they don't speak English. So they will not answer your email because they're busy with so many requests. So that's something to consider. How do you deal with the language? Are we going to communicate minimum into 3 languages, always French, English, and Portuguese, whatever we do? We have to keep that in mind because it could be a serious issue. Another argument, of course, which is very important, the finance. How to convince these different African states to get involved, knowing their very little interest and understanding of contemporary art. I'm talking at the government level, not the corporate business or other people. How do you fund and sustain grants for a project of this scale? Because when you do a project, a kickoff, it's quite easy. Let's say it's easier for the first edition to get grants because people see it as a new initiative. Everybody is full of goodwill. That's what happened with K. But then how do you sustain, knowing that you're touring? How do you sustain the funding? We're not talking about just one conference. We're talking about a large-scale Pan-African biennial. That's a huge budget. I know the budget of the Dakar Biennale. And when I see it in an African context, people are just shocked, like, oh my God, Senegal is putting this much money. And it's nothing if you compare it to the budget of Manifesta or, of course, of Venice or Sao Paulo Biennial. But this is an issue to keep in mind. How do you sustain the grants? Another even bigger issue for me is mobility. We as Africans know how hard and expensive it is to travel within the continent, especially if you're changing from one region to another. Some countries are easy to access by plane or bus, but in some cases it can take you 24 hours and cost you more than 1,500 euros. Basically, when I'm in Dakar, it's cheaper for me to go to Paris and pay, let's say, 700 euros. If I want to go to Cameroon in Central Africa, then I will have to pay 1,500 euros. And I need a visa, because that's the next on my list about mobility. Remember, we're not a country, huh? So you really have to be addicted then to art if you are going to attend and pay those kind of amounts or spend 24 hours on a flight just to see that Biennale. Or does that mean that some countries will be left out forever because they're not easy to access? That's also a question. How do you make the choices where to go and why? And of course, what I just said, visa is also another issue that we should never underestimate, because some African countries are more friendly than others. It's easy to get a visa for some people. I don't need a visa to go to, as a Senegalese, to go to South Africa, but other African countries need a visa to go to South Africa. And if you're an artist, you might not get it because they might see you as somebody who's immigrating just to steal jobs or whatever. And it's the same in Cameroon. It's not that easy for me to get a visa for Cameroon because at the moment the two presidents don't like each other. So you have to deal with all these kind of politics and all these local soups. And visa is going to be an issue. Travel is going to be an issue. So mobility at large, that's also an issue you have to consider. And that brings me to the geographic coverage. How do you frame and secure this roaming? How do you decide where to host this event and why? How to make sure that there will be an equal balance between English, French, and Portuguese-speaking countries? Another issue is diversity. Based on the growing number of private art spaces in Africa, isn't it not more important to help reinforce and sustain local initiatives throughout the continent? Why don't we give a chance to multiple voices in multiple places to be heard simultaneously worldwide instead of one rooming Biennale? Because that's what's happening. In the south of the Sahara, the first independent art space was Douala in Cameroon, which I mentioned, which is doing this new kind of mini biennial based on site-specific project in the city with the municipality. And we saw the growth of art spaces and centers, independent ones, mainly at the turn of the millennium. And a new generation of curators, here they are. And their will is to be based on the continent and to work from there. And it's hard for them to get access to funding. Network, that easy. We all know each other. We know how to get hold of each other. We exchange ideas. We support each other. But how to support these initiatives? They are having a hard time. They don't have funding from the governments. They don't have sometimes funding from other people locally. And they are all looking for international grants. And that cannot keep on going forever. So instead of one rooming Biennale, why are we not supporting initiatives that already exist and shakers and movers that we know who are doing great projects over there? Why don't we support them and have a variety of propositions and of projects happening all over the place and every time? So those are my 6 arguments against that I will mainly call as warnings. And as a conclusion, just to open the discussion, I would say, well, if you're sure that you want to go for a rooming Biennale, why not? But then be careful and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Ngone. I would like now to welcome Thembinkosi Goniwe on stage.
Thanks, Gabi. Can you hear me? This is so strange. Why you look so serious? After all, it's Sunday today. I think Ngcobo has done most of the job. I don't know where to start because I don't want to repeat most of what she has said, but I'm just going to scatter around. I support the idea of a roaming Biennale. Of course, I do that with skepticism, which is based on some of the things Ngcobo have said, especially questions of logistics, questions of support, as far as finances, skills, expertise, infrastructure, human capacity, resource, and so forth. But also, I still believe, as a creative thinker, that we should not trap ourselves in the materiality of things. It's always good to dream. That's what my contribution is going to be. Of course, some people think I'm a romantic here, which is all well and good as well. There's a tendency to stress the difficulties and the negativities that take place in that continent called Africa. But also there's a potential. People do travel, cross borders, in spite of the difficulties. So I don't see why not can we not dream and take a chance of a possibility of an idea that can transcend or create possibilities that might be something that we might say in 10 years, 20 years. It was good to be part of that initiative. So I do support the idea. But of course I do so, without undermining or underestimating what Ngcobo has mentioned in terms of all these difficulties. But my stress is on what seems to be lacking every time we talk about Africa, the idea of fun and pleasure, the possibilities of what it means to be beautiful, things that are taking place in that continent. How about maybe we think of a Biennale or of a project that begins to talk about fun, like soccer, for example. South Africa hosted the World Cup soccer tournament, and it was called an African event. Many people came, of course, thanks to Spain that won. And a number of countries came there from Africa. They played, they lost, thanks to Ghana. I'm sure Senam is happy. We started saying Bafana Bafana, and then later we're talking about Ghana. Our disappointment with Nigeria was, oh God, right? Same with Cameroon. So what I'm saying, some spaces, some countries, some cities that are going to host such events are going to be disappointing. But we didn't know that Ghana will travel so far. So what I'm saying, why don't we take a chance? And say, let's do this thing. But my insistence will be to do it in a very small scale. Because one of the problems, we want to start big. And big things require skills, expertise, and a lot of money. And we know that Africa doesn't have that money. So if we start small, as Ngcobo said, there are local events. How about identifying those sites that are already, having these events, that we can begin to collaborate with them? If I'm thinking of a Biennale, it's almost every 2 years. And Africa is more than 53 countries, right? So we're talking about 106 years here. That's exactly, why not? Isn't what we do when we do art, we fantasize? Let's leave that space of imagination. That's what I want us to do. So what I'm saying basically is I think it is possible if we begin to identify those sites. Because South Africa won the bid for the World Cup, not because only of Mandela, because of the infrastructure. South Africa has best infrastructure across the continent. It's so unfortunate and very disappointing that even its own activities, such as the Johannesburg Biennial, didn't last. Same with the Cape. And yet, if you go to South Africa, we have a lot of money. But that money goes outside. It funds America, it funds Europe, it funds now. China is coming to take that money, So what I'm asking is, how do we begin to also access those kind of resources that can be channeled to other parts of the continent? And for example, there are already spaces, whether you're talking about Egypt or whether you're talking about Nigeria, you're talking about Dakar, we are talking about Bamako, those are already existing spaces. So I think the discussion should be beginning to ask what is that is taking place in these spaces. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? That's where I think we can begin to think. And then in that way, we can identify a process which can move from one side to another. So that at least in 10 years' time, we'll be able to say, yes, Dhaka has improved in terms of the facility because we managed to take so much money from South Africa and put it there. Maybe after 4 or 5 years, we might say the Bamako photographic Biennial is working because we managed to take money from Dhaka and put it there. As I said, I'm dreaming, because I know some of these presidents and the politicians are in conflict. But also the idea, I think, should also be thinking about. There's a lot of waste in arts. We put a lot of money, please understand me, making video, making performance. Some of them are so irrelevant to local experiences, to practicalities of everyday living. So maybe the appeal is also to ask the creative thinkers to find ways in which the kind of project that are supported have also a bearing on the local experiences in terms of the facilities, in terms of the living experiences of people. I'll give an example. I believe Senam is going to pick it up. There's a festival in South Africa, in Johannesburg, which takes place for 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. One of the things they do is to take a township and create a festival. They invite different art players, musicians, visual artists, actors, as well as fashion designers, and architects, and so forth. So one of the proposals which I was asked to make was to think of ways in which what is left behind at the end of that festival. Because 3 days short is nice, we come, we dance, like here in Spain, we've been drinking every night, right? Good party. Bad wine, of course, but good beer, thanks. So what I'm saying is, one of the ideas is to design projects where you invite skilled and creative people to work with, for example, locals, where you take a block of flats, ask designers to redesign those houses, repaint them, refashion them, so that at the end of the Biennale, or whatever activities we name it, something is left for the local people, instead of always depending. Because one of the problems with Africa, we always depend on the government. We're always looking for charities from Europe. And the creative expertise are wasted. We put all this infrastructure, we put all the monitors, we come and perform, and the local people seem not to understand. They get lost in our performances, in our conceptual art, and they ask what the shit was going on. And millions are pumped in that way. At the end of it, local people didn't get to experience it, didn't get to enjoy it. As artists, we live. We put in our CVs. I was in Spain. I was in Dhaka. I was in Nigeria. But what about the locals? So what I'm asking, how about designing projects, this kind of rooming biennale? If we are doing it in Mali, for example, how about identifying a city and its surrounding where we can put infrastructure? Ask architects to redesign some of the spaces. Ask interior design to refashion some of the houses. Ask artists to work with locals to redesign the setup so that at the end of that event, there's something left at the level of what you call it, everyday material experiences of people. Instead of us spending all that money creating all these shit, little objects that even locals cannot afford. They are shit at the end of the day. And we make fuss about them, right? We do. Someone will spend, I do, of a small piece, 100,000 words, cracking my head of whatever shit Picasso was painting. You know, that is well and good for intellectual and elites, but for the day-to-day experiences of ordinary people. I use the word ordinary in quote unquote, because there's no ordinary citizen. But for those outside of the radar of the so-called creative and artistic art world, they don't understand what's going on. And we are using their money in terms of taxes from the government funding. We are using their money in terms of their labor, which is exploited through this kind of corporate that puts money into these events. So what I'm asking, how do we redirect those resources into durable infrastructures? So it is that kind of idea I'm thinking about if this sort of biennale is going to take place. You know, I'm just using the word biennale because that's what I was asked to talk about. It could be triennale, maybe it could be quadriennale, why not? It could take, like document after 5 years, what's the rush? Maybe we should invent something yet different. How about doing it every 10 years? 7 years, right? That's why I'm saying I'm dreaming. I know some people are like, oh God, but I like to dream, why not? So that's one point. So I just want to go back to the point I introduced in terms of this fun. We take ourselves too seriously. In that way, we alienate people who distance, though are not part of the club. Maybe when we create fun, projects that are fun, but also have practical end, we can start to engage people, from young up to old. Let's also move away from this idea of always looking at things. Let's engage with things. Let's make our audience make things. How about designing, inviting creatives who are going to set up projects that are going to be interactive at the level of making and leaving something behind? That's what basically I'm saying. If you're going to have this Biennale, I'll propose those kind of ideas. But of course, I'm doing that without being romantic, Of course, Ngone talked about the idea of access, sharing. I've been, on my way, I was reading the last Manifesta publication on collective curating. I like the idea of collective curating, but still have issues about it. But two things I pick up there. The idea of democracy, the idea of sharing. When you bring different minds together, you're asking them to share. But at the same time, you are aware that there will be tension, contention, because 2-3 people don't think the same thing. It is out of those contention that I think we can find a move. I don't think we need to agree all the time. Otherwise, there won't be movement. The notion of dialectic has to do with forces opposing each other. I'm not talking about binaries here, opposing forces. I'm talking about dialectics whereby differences are forces us to move. So maybe whatever we're going to do with this Biennale, it should be a collective effort of different minds, opposing minds, so that they can create a force, a shift. Another one, of course, those minds should also share at the level of experiences, the level of skills, expertise. And also, I want us to move away from patronizing the continent. Some of us are living there. And South Africa is not a third world country. It's very advanced even in some of the European countries. If you've been to South Africa, it's beautiful. The infrastructure is incredible, so much that sometimes I ask myself why we refer to as a developing country. It's better than Spain to some extent. So what I'm saying then, let's stop patronizing it. Let's ask what is it that is in place, and then work with those kind of developments. It's only then I do think that we are going to move. Because this idea of charity, of always looking down, it creates this project of always supporting the victim. And the victim don't move outside of that victimhood because they know they're victims. They depend on charity. If Manifesto has the money, let us give the money. Don't donate the money. Give the money as you would give to other European artists to produce projects. It should not be a charity. It should not be like a kind of, shame. That's what basically I'm saying. If you're funding an artist that lives somewhere in Barcelona or somewhere in Netherlands, it should be the case with African artists of all sorts. Once we create that sense of recognition, and then we are going to move. That's one way of thinking of how to empower people. The last point I want to make is when we talk about languages, but also the question of context here, specificity of place. If this project is going to be sustainable and effective, it needs time in terms of research. Hence I was saying maybe 10 years is still little, maybe we should say 25 years. We put time in researching, because through research, you discover things by accident or by chance. But if you put 2 years, that's one of the failure of the Cape. Because the rush, the speed at which things were done, they overlook the specificities of the context in which that project was taking place. Africa is complex, like any other species. So what I'm saying then, maybe we need to pay attention. If you're going to do it in Mali, maybe there should be a process whereby we spend time researching in Mali. It should not be about the outcome. It should be about the process which we undertake in order to arrive at the outcome. I don't believe at the ends, I believe in means. So once we discover that process of means towards the end, I think something will come out of that. I think I've said a lot, right? How am I doing with time, Gabi? very well. On that note, I want to thank you.
Critical ideas and points that have come out of this session. One of them is logistics, political will, and how we activate this will. The language issue, which is a big issue. The finance issue is also a very big issue. Mobility issues. And there's also a point that was touched on by Ngone, which is a wider access to art education. And I think in principle, this is also Thembinkosi's concern, because he's involved in education and teaching at an art school. And also there's a question of publication, access to publications, and continental networks. I really enjoyed that you also made references to fun, or to ways of engaging with how we experience pleasure, because there's a lot of pleasurable moments in our continent and in our cities. And also the reference to soccer, because you know what makes soccer accessible more than art. There is a roaming soccer biennale in Africa, and it's called the Africa Cup of Nations. It happens every 2 years in a different country. It's a model, you know, similar to Manifesta. And I think it's a viable model to also like piggyback on. You know, we can look at it like this. Can we piggyback on soccer? Thembi, you curated an exhibition piggybacking on the World Cup, which is called Space. You know, it would be interesting to maybe somehow share those experiences if you have any ideas on how this kind of proposed model could work based on that experience. But yeah, at the same time, I would like to hear more about this wider access to art education. And Ngone, you have a platform called GAO, which I have seen only once in action during the 2006 Biennale in Dakar. And it's very much based on education and access to education. I know you've even attempted the almost impossible when it comes to language, where you had a radio show and you were trying to talk about art in Wolof and those difficulties. I'd like just to invite you to talk to each other a little bit before I open the platform to the audience. Thanks. How do we deal with the microphone?
How do we talk to each other? Maybe okay, we stand here, so let's perform. Okay. You keep the mic. Okay. No, we can stand here, we perform. I'm petite, so we can share. I can share.
Don't dance.
I won't dance, don't worry. Well, yes, about art education. Yes, of course that's important, because in some countries don't have art schools. That's also one of the issues, that if you're doing a roaming biennale, people will have a better, or let's say, the beginning of an understanding of what are these bizarre people doing stuff? What is this about? Or that it's not just about sofa art, what I call sofa art, that you're doing a nice painting for a villa, or you're doing tourist art or airport art. Basically, with that collective, what I was trying to do when you're saying art education, it was art education actually for the elite. Because they are that's the market we have. Because when we talk about art market, you think of big collectors, galleries, museums buying, in most of the countries in West Africa, that's my region, that's the one I can talk about the best, the market is a local market of local people buying art for their houses. And they buy art the way they will buy curtains or sofa or whatever. So they would go to a studio and say, oh, I wish it was blue. Can you make it in blue? Can you make it bigger? I'm saying that about Dakar, but I also saw that in Paris, actually. So we don't have to be ashamed about it. It's something, I guess, we all share. And I was, what I also wanted, because as you said, South Africa is rich, but we have rich people all over the continent. And of course, it's a cliche when we say that we're poor. You're not poor. And what I wanted that Senegalese elite. Oh, I thought he was going to beat me up. Nice. And what I wanted exactly with that project, with that kind of project, I was testing different models, actually. And I wanted the Senegalese elite to make a financial commitment and to get out of sofa art and to stop seeing me as the bizarre intellectual who will come back speaking English and talking about what's happening in the world, and them saying, but no, I just need a new painting for my kitchen or for my beach house or whatever. So that was the idea. I wanted them to make a financial commitment and to invest in art production locally. For me, it's a matter of self-esteem. So that was the kind of project I was doing in jazz clubs, because I deliberately targeted them, went to places where they happened to have lunch and dinners and cocktails, and squatting those places. It was a strategy of squatting places, chic places in Dakar, and just talking about art in a very simple way that they can understand, not in an academic way, but just saying, bring in some artists and let's talk about art, and let's talk about the issues artists are dealing with. Let's talk about the aesthetics. Let's talk about the politics of it. And then it opened the mind of some people, and luckily some people I know in Dakar started to see art and contemporary art in a totally different way, and started, when they travel, going to galleries and museums, which they will never do before. And some of them were financial partners of the last Dakar Biennale, which was a quite interesting thing. So basically what I was doing is, in Dakar, it was targeting the elite. On the other hand, what I was also doing is with young kids in popular neighborhoods with video animation of some artists who were doing video animation and couldn't find a space to show their videos because the Modern Art Museum in Dakar is closed for a long time. And I was just screening these animation films, just putting a curtain in the street at night and saying to the kids, there's a movie tonight. And saying to the artists, are you ready to be criticized by a young audience who has no idea that you're an artist? They have no idea what an artist is. Some of them don't even speak French. They basically just speak Wolof. And some of them even left school at 10 years old or even before that. And because it's video animation made by young Senegalese artists, it was more accessible medium. So it was those kind of moving theater screening in the streets. Also that strategy of squatting the city. So those are two examples, one for the kids in popular areas and another for the elite, about how do you talk about art. That was also part of the radio program. How do you talk about art if you want to reach and go beyond people who just speak French because they've been to school? How do you talk about art in your supposedly mother tongue, which is Wolof? Of course, it was tough, but I did it as an exercise. I think I was basically trying to challenge myself, and also I wanted people to see things in a different way and even say, you have the right to talk about art. It's not, you don't need a PhD in art history to be able to make a commentary on art. So those are the kind of projects with that collective that we are doing, squatting places basically in town. We're squatters. And Thembi, as a lecturer, he's more in the academic side. I'm not an academic. I was trained as an architect, so I have more freedom of speaking of whatsoever. He's an academic. So what is your experience?
Thank you, Ngcobo, for frying me. You know, I try to speak as just a simple person, because I believe that's where the power of communication is. when we strip all of this complexity, when we simplify language and the things we do. And that's one of the potential of contemporary art. It provides those moments. Although some of us work so hard to make things obscure, peculiar, and all of that nonsense. By nonsense, I'm not being rude, I'm just nonsensical, confuse people. So, Gabi mentioned the idea of the Roaming Biennale to appropriate the model of the Africa Cup, right? That's a good example of things happening on that continent. And every 2 years, that cup happens. It came to South Africa, it went to Burkina Faso, it's going to go to other places. And African countries go and play. Some of the players live in Europe, they live both on the continent. Same with contemporary artists, they live, back and forth. And I don't see why that model cannot be appropriated. But of course, there's something different with soccer, because you find business and corporate putting money more than the government. It's more entertaining, it's less critical about social and political issues. That's the disadvantage of working in the cultural field, is that our criticality poses threat to those who have money, right? So the best thing is always to find ways in which we compromise, we rub shoulders with those who control money. I need to sleep with so-and-so in order to get money.
I don't.
Not you, I'm talking about me. I say I didn't say we. Thanks, God. It's just a metaphor.
Can you give us names?
I will, I'm sure. The president of some of the, let's not mention people. Anyway, what I'm saying is, that's one model, but I think for me it is important that we look at specificities of each place or of each site in which we are going to work. That's why I was saying earlier, we need to identify existing projects or activities. If you are going to start something scratch, the resource can be wasted. That was one of the faults with Cape, for example. They didn't build on what was existing in Cape Town. They didn't look at what was happening in Johannesburg. They rather used those as a kind of historical argument to motivate for the project. So what I'm saying, if there's something happening in Alexandria, if there's something happening in Lagos, let's reinforce those. Let's enter a dialogue with those activities, those kind of projects, and begin to put resources so that we improve the condition, we improve the possibilities of making it work, but also to set up for something next, right? Because it's true that art is not funded as the way soccer it is funded. If we are appropriating that model, we also need to be critical in terms of what is going to work or not. So, on that, as an educator, I don't like the idea of being a lecturer. I'm not an academic. I always,
I'm teasing you.
I know, Ngoni. I always introduce myself as a scholar. What that means, someone who's learning, studying. Of course, the academy provides that luxury of not being worried about the world over. That's what universities do. They pay us to teach, to lie, create crap, sit in the library, mark, write my reports, The possibility of that creative space intellectually, it's a luxury. I cannot relinquish, I have to defend it. Thanks to the, French critic, Michael Foucault, we have to defend freedom. And we have to defend the citizenship of what it means to be an intellectual. Same for artists. We need to defend those spaces. We need to fight for those spaces, because without the luxury of creative thinking, the world is going to die. Imagine, wake up the next day, you cannot see color, you cannot see shape, you cannot see the smell of things. God, I don't want to live in that world. So I see myself as that person who's studying for possibilities of seeing differently. I don't want to change the world. The world is already fucked up. Why should I? I arrived at 30-something years ago. Why should I change? I didn't mess it up. Why should I take the responsibility? All I want to do is to add color. If there's something dark there, I want to maybe put bright red or bright yellow. That's why I'm wearing red turquoise. Let me see. People are dull today. It's Sunday.
Not me.
Not you. It's true.
Thanks, God.
Oh, my darling sister. Africa is bright as we know. Except London. Dark black people wearing
So you
black.
think education is something important?
Education is important in that way, to think about it in ways in which it opens up ways of thinking. I don't like the idea of educating professionals. Let's educate citizenship who are able to think different about their own experiences, to find ways of navigating. But the problem with universities, like also schools, we teach people to be professional and career-driven. And that's exactly what the art world has become. The idea of creating different ways of thinking is secondary. So what I'm saying then is, those spaces, let's say BC Silver, for example, in Lagos, that's a beautiful space. It's an initiative that one person has put it up, and the kind of like activities it's doing, attracting people from different parts of the continent, but also outside. That's what I'm saying. Bassam, for example, is here. The kind of project they're doing there in Alexandria. So those are sites I'm talking about. Even if you come to Joburg, there's Bag Factory, there's other sites, you go to Cape Town. So those are sites, I think, for me, they are more productive than the university. Because the university are so rigid. Some of us are working within them, but under constraints. I can only make sense when I go outside. So what I'm saying is, if the Biennial is going to room like a soccer, let's look at those spaces. And then let's
what
put
about countries where there's not such a space?
Well, that's where you start to ask who's there, because also it's not about
We
initiative.
know who's there.
But let's enter conversation with those. Most of those countries then will be behind the queue. Maybe they'll be like after 10, 100
But
years.
there's not that much country with spaces, art spaces, independent art spaces.
Yes, there's not much, but there's already.
Sorry?
Let's name Goni, for example, Maputo, there's something in Kenya, in Angola, in South Africa, in Dakar, in Cameroon, in Egypt, in Nigeria. I'm already reaching 10. That's a lot. Ethiopia, that's a lot. So what I'm saying is, as I was saying, if we have 10, it means every 5 years, it means we are talking about 50 years to go.
I will be dead.
No, it's fine. We're not doing for ourselves, we're doing for future generation. What's the rush?
No, you can't rush, but still.
Still, I agree with you. But I'm saying, there are those spaces. I'm not pressured, because I don't believe, because, for example, where I teach, we admit about 70 students. I only invest about 5 or 3 of them. So I cannot teach the 70. I teach them as a class. But in terms of investment, I know 10 of them are going to make it in the real world of practicing art. The others are going to be managers, restaurant owners, and all of that shit. So why should I waste my resource? Same in the art world. So same